breeze whistled in through the open temple door as Byron Haynes sat in meditation, focusing on opening his senses, stretching his body beyond its physical limits. He sensed his teacher across from him also meditating. His bodyguard, Raleigh Varick, stood behind him, back pressed against the wall, head down in patient contemplation. The stones surrounding them kept everyone out despite the open doorway. There were no windows, and the only sources of light were torches, giving everything a soft orange glow. Byron had been sitting there for the last hour, perhaps 2, he thought. He smiled. 3 years ago, as a very young kid of just 12, he never imagined he would master the patience to stay in this state of complete yielding. The breeze blew across his back. The shirt he wore offered little protection, but if he had felt it, there was no indication. Caitlin Cass, his master, stood and took in the scene. She wasn't tall, but men feared her and her stark black hair and tense brown eyes. Her skin was pale white and glowed orange in the torchlight. She was aged, but her face did not yet sag, and her body gave no hint that it might be feeble. Caitlin had taken Byron on as her student at the request of the boy's father, William. She had never found a reason to be disappointed in her task. Byron was almost ready to head into the world. She only hoped William had a few more days to hold on.
Take your stance, Byron. It's time.
Byron obeyed out of habit and no longer fear of disappointing her. She smiled as she took her own stance. Byron wasn't large by any stretch, though he'd had a growth spurt very recently and had left him 5'6" and just over 120 pounds. Those, however, were the basic features one might miss over his unique ones. Byron Hayne, Royal Prince of the Stonehaven Keep, had short, bright white hair, which moved almost like a wisp of cloud caught in the breeze. His eyes were the one piece that always took Cass a second to accept. They were bright purple. These identifying features made it hard for him to blend in, as everyone would know who he was instantly. He wore a hood, almost always, when in public, for non-royal affairs, and Cass wondered often how he coped with it. She shook that thought quickly, but got back to the task at hand, setting herself mentally and beginning the pour inside her mind. She beckoned her student forward.
Begin.
No sooner had the word exited her mouth, Byron was on the attack. He was fast and capable, as he easily repelled her counter blows in the midst of her flurry. Cass was fully focused, and once she forced him a few strides back, she focused for a few seconds, and suddenly there were 3 of her. Her power of multiplicity had guaranteed victory many times, but by virtue of its appearance. But Byron was no amateur. He'd seen it several times in the last 3 years. He easily countered the extra visions of his master. Byron knocked one back with a hard punch, and then ducked and swept the legs of another. This time he called on his own powers, increasing his strength and speed. He had delayed this to try and throw off his master. His body ached as muscles expanded just a little, tendons stretched, and bones hardened to nearly a breaking point. Though the pain would be unbearable to most, Byron had learned through meditating to put the pain at the back of his mind. He'd mastered this just a few months ago, and his slew of combat successes with his master were proof. He couldn't stifle the grunt that escaped him, though, but he didn't give Cass the satisfaction of hearing it, as he pressed the attack on the still upright third form of his master. Cass was impressed. He had nearly mastered everything she had taught him. In her reminiscence, though, she failed to sense his attack and took a blow directly to her side. Byron, using the power to put some ground between him and his opponent, knew better than to press now, as Cass could just make more copies of herself in retaliation. She nodded approval. This is what it had been like for the last few months. Few words spoken, just fighting and training in complete wordless action. Byron preferred it that way. Talking was not his favorite thing. He pressed the attack once more, but used more kicks to keep the distance between him and Cass. It worked, as she did not make more copies, and at least one of them appeared to be injured. The only way to stop her using her power was to knock the original version out, as all the other forms were tied to her consciousness. After a few minutes, he felt he had gauged which one it was by the types of attacks that they employed. He pressed one more time, but was caught as the other 2 quickly circled in behind and struck his back with kicks, forcing him to a knee. He didn't let the momentary humiliation stop him, as the blows had done almost nothing to his strengthened skin. Byron jumped up into the air and threw a kick behind him, knocking one down and then quickly using a flurry of fists to dispatch the other. He turned, and Cass could see his anger was rising. She was disappointed. After so many weeks of trying, he was still impulsive and quick to anger. She moved herself to put some distance between them, but her side ached with bruising, she was sure. If he got a flurry off before she regained herself, she was unsure of how much damage he could do. Byron hoped his face didn't give anything away. He patiently closed the distance with his master, and then, in a gust, he stood behind her. He heard her swear, and he smiled. He punched her with a few light blows to the back, and then finished with a push kick, forcing her to one knee.
Ty.
Byron's word couldn't hide the tinge of ego he felt just now. Cass held up her right hand in irritation to let Byron know the fight was concluded. The clone she created dissipated into mist. Byron, relaxing his own power, and as often happened, he felt like a pole rope gaining slack. It was only a small feeling, but other times this feeling had resulted in his collapse after combat had concluded.
This is not about score, Prince.
Cass chose the title for Byron because she knew it bothered him. It had the desired result when Byron spoke next.
Yes, ma'am.
Now remain here while I tend to my wounds. Meditate on this battle, and then you and I will go see your father.
Cass didn't wait for him to respond, and simply turned, heading from the room and to her quarters to treat her smarting side. Byron silently went back to his spot where he had been meditating, nearly forgetting about his bodyguard Varric's presence until the man spoke.
Nice job.
Varric had slid down the wall to a sitting position sometime during the fight, Byron supposed. He now had his arms out, each elbow on a bent knee. He wore a soft brown shirt and freshly made leather pants that were a dark red. He'd saved his money for weeks just to buy them. Byron sneered as he looked the man over. His attitude was lazy, and often Byron got the impression that he hated his job. Byron had been given a bodyguard shortly after his older brother Benjamin had left without a note. Only his father had received a note from Benji, as Byron had taken to calling him, usually in a whining little brother tone. That was 5 years ago, and in short order Varric had been put at his side, never to leave.
If this is so much of a problem, why don't you just leave?
Because you know I can't do that.
Varric spoke forcefully, in an attempt to get his charge to drop it. His long brown hair hid his annoyed expression. This wasn't the first time they'd had this conversation over the last 5 years.
Stand up. Now!
Varric didn't know why. It was almost involuntary, but he did stand as requested.
Take your stance. I've taken enough from you.
The words reflected the pained irritation in Byron's voice as he took his own stance against the approaching man, almost 2 full decades his senior. Varric threw his hair out of his face, and as the longest strands settled almost neatly across his shoulders, Byron could see the expression held there was just as irritated.
This isn't what you want, kid.
I will...
Byron didn't have a chance to finish his sentence as a blood-curdling scream shot through the open door to the outside world. Both men snapped to their senses and ran to see what had caused such a horrid sound. They were soon joined by Cass, who asked them if they knew what was going on.
I have no idea.
Byron began feeling a rush of adrenaline when he answered her.
Let's go toward the square and find out. Varric, stay together with Byron and follow behind. Don't start any fighting unless I give the word.
This is writer-director Joshua Kisberg, and you're listening to Shepard, Journey of the Time Walker.
The keep was protected by a barrier maintained by King William's abilities. Soon that barrier would fade away. Cass prepared herself for the worst. When she reached the square, her student and his bodyguard close behind.
People were fleeing into the square from the gates, and even some guards rushed past them, going towards the gate to take defensive positions against whatever enemy lay in wait beyond. The barrier that protected them was invisible, but could be sensed by those who knew how to look, and only those who had been so blessed could pass through it unharmed. Caitlin Cass reached out with her senses, and really, for the first time in months, felt the cracks and weakness in this barrier.
Then that must mean...
She was speaking to no one in particular, but if they'd understood her meaning, it would have increased the panic even further. Soon enough, despite slowing her pace to a quick walk, she was near the gates. Her eyes widened as she saw the beast before her. The Twisted. Normal humans who'd been altered to have greater than average physical strength, stamina, and speed. Not to the extent that her and her race shared, but enough to make war on the last humans on Earth and the few shepherds who aimed to protect them. She had seen the work of the Twisted Armies before. The man who created them was driven by rage, a former shepherd believing the only true course was to exterminate humanity, even though that was not the purpose intended for them. Their namesake, Shepherd, had been an illustration of their using their gifts to ensure the best possible outcomes for human potential despite their nature. She looked at the army, not too large, but enough to do a great deal of damage. Despite that assessment, she looked on in disgust more than fear. They had been tasked so many thousands of years ago with using their power to save and lead humanity from the shadows.
You can't let them find him yet.
It wasn't so much of a voice as it was a whisper of a feeling inside her body. She was only confused for a moment before speaking back.
I understand.
The gate area was mostly clear when she began. It never hurt to clone herself, but it did make her dizzy sometimes. Usually she did no more than 2 or 3, but this time she started the pour inside herself and did not stop. Soon there were 4, then 8, then 16. All told, by the time she stopped, even she was unaware of how many there were. The blurry vision in her eyes told her she wouldn't have much time in this state, so she and her army of new selves made their way to clash with the twisted humans outside.
No, she told us to wait.
Varric grabbed the prince by the shoulder to control him, but Byron snapped his arm free. They were on a roof overlooking what was now a battlefield, witnessing the appearance of all of Caitlin Cass's clones. They both knew what this was costing her, and though he'd spoken her wish, Varric found it just as hard to heed.
Caitlin had never fought on this scale before, and it took several moments to settle her mind to ensure that she could fight properly. She found a certain mental rhythm to it eventually, even as she felt her breathing become labored and red spots form on the back of her closed eyes.
The Twisted Army seemed relentless, no matter how many she killed. How many were there? She couldn't tell, and it didn't matter. She pushed any thought of regret out of her mind. She steeled her will as the numbers surged, and then suddenly stopped.
Bravo, Lady Caitlin. A man stepped out of the crowd of mindless raging humans. Her senses were too far gone from the drain of the fighting to take in anything other than his voice. She knew it instantly as she tried squinting from her knees where she'd collapsed in a heap of exhaustion. Her clones dissipated into mist that almost made it appear as if an eruption of fog had suddenly come in. His name was Darren, also known in darker circles as the Puppeteer. With the ability to control minds and bodies, he was of great service to the man known as Jakin. She was now certain that there was no more time. He hadn't created this army, this message, just wielded it. Jakin was at least free to use his powers once again. Caitlin fought to stay conscious as the world spun, even with her eyes closed. If Darren was here, Jakin would be ready to move much sooner than she or William had hoped. She heard Darren's steps in the dirt as it ground beneath his feet. She never saw the kick coming. I have been waiting 35 years to do that. Caitlin regretted the fact that the lack of response from her body made it so she couldn't sneer at him. She felt the world slipping away. This was it. She knew she had used too much of her power. She waited for the final blow, annoyed more that it would be struck by such an unworthy opponent. The blow never came.
Leave her alone!
It was Byron's voice. She would have shouted for him to stay back if she had the strength, and then she heard several blows connect, but she didn't know who had hit whom. She tried her hardest to open her eyes, but they were too heavy. Then she had her answer. Byron's arms lifted her from the ground where she lay after being kicked to a half-seated position. She somehow managed to bring a hand to his face.
Byron, I'm sorry, but this is where we part ways.
She couldn't see his reaction, but she felt his hands tense as he held her up.
We didn't realize the time was so close. I would have prepared you more. I would have done so many things different.
Please, Master, don't talk.
Byron's emotion in his words spoke most of his age. He was still so young and inexperienced in the world. It pained Cass in ways she couldn't even understand. When she spoke next, it was with the most comfort she could offer.
Prince, I am proud of you, and in the coming days and months you will bring a light and a force to the world that hasn't been seen in 200 years.
Caitlin felt a building in her chest.
There will be trials, but you are so very strong. You have not tested your limits.
She attempted a smile.
Now go see your father.
He's already here.
William Hayne, King of the Stone Keep, spoke softly, but all faces turned to him. It made sense to Varric now why Darren had scrambled away so quickly. The man who was barely 50, but looked centuries old, slowly walked and knelt down, despite his clean green and gold royal robes, so that he might look upon his friend who was dying in his son's arms. Varric didn't watch the scene with Cass, as he was keeping the puppeteer at bay. It was with a little relief when the man scrambled away and the remains of his army followed. So sudden was it that Varric's face showed the shock of it.
Dad.
The word slipped from Byron's lips without him meaning it to. It was only one word, but it spoke pain, pleading, and need, all in its simple, involuntary expression. He looked up at his father, so aged and wrinkled. His gray beard could sometimes hide how he felt. What Byron saw in his face, however, was sadness. Father and son both knew that Cass was dying. There was nothing to be done. They stayed as she slipped from consciousness, and her breathing became less and less, and then stopped. When someone overused their powers, the cost was almost always their life. Cass had faced the first battle of the coming war, and became its first casualty at the same time. It was only a few minutes later that William spoke words into the silence.
Son, we need to return to the throne room. I have much to tell you.
The words were focused and direct, showing no sign of the tragedy just befallen them. Placing a hand on his son's shoulder once more, he lifted himself off the ground and then looked to rally Varric, who still stood silent watch, as was his job.
Please see that her body is tended to, and then join us.
Varric nodded, hiding his own pained expression behind his long hair. He knelt down and carefully scooped Caitlin Cass's body into his arms, one under her back and one under her knees. He started to walk when he realized something. He called to a guard tower.
Watchmen, send 2 men on horseback to the surrounding villages. See if they need aid or have been destroyed. Then, send word to Valenport. The Stone Keep requires military aid. Do so without delay!
Message delivered, Varric began to make the trek back towards the throne room. No doubt his charge was being woken to a new and strange world. He felt a small wave of pity wash over him.
This is Kevin Anderson, your narrator. You are listening to Shepherd, Journey of the Time Walker.
Byron entered the throne room, now under the arm of his father as the man had labored up the stairs to get into the room. Byron had seen his father weak in recent months, but it was getting worse. He helped the man to his seat on the throne and took the advisor's seat next to him. The throne room was mostly bare, with a few banners to break up the plain gray stone that dominated it. The floor was a little more lively, with a rug that covered the entire floor, red with a snake twisted around a shield in its center. Byron quietly stared at the crust on the floor for many moments as his father and he waited for Raleigh Varric to arrive. Byron stared at his own palms as time passed too slowly, suddenly realizing the weight they'd held earlier. The death of his master began to creep into his mind.
He's arrived.
Byron snapped out of his contemplation and focused on the man walking up from the wooden double doors.
Sire, she has been tended.
Varric took a knee.
Thank you. Rise now. We need to get started. Things are moving with much greater speed than I realized.
William drew in breath and began to tell his own story of the city, the last 35 years, and of a battle with the legendary Jaqen that had nearly claimed his life.
When I was your age, Byron, Jakin had made war on humanity and us shepherds for 15 years. He was unstoppable, and he had killed millions and millions with his armies of twisted humans. Those are the beings that you saw here this morning. A night attack may have gone better, but Jakin wants us to know who it is.
What are the Twisted, Father?
Byron was not quite clear on how they existed.
They are humans, gifted with enhanced physical attributes, but lacking intelligence or direction. They are mindless beasts, woven with the base of our power. They often die within months of being turned. As we summon our powers using our own life force energies, they expend their small flames of life in agony and confusion.
Byron once again thought back to his fallen master. Feeling his wandering attention, William spoke again.
35 years ago, I waged a battle against Jakin with Cass and my old master, Varius. We'd managed to slip into his stronghold thanks to my master's cloaking abilities, but we still met up with resistance. We fought our way through to his war chamber.
William's face twisted in painful memory.
When we confronted Jakin, he was more monster than human or shepherd. We fought for a long while, all of us pushing our physical limits. Even 3-on-1 and matching his abilities to bend reality were not enough. I realized that I would have to kill him.
The next words he spoke seemed whimsical, almost happy.
That was when the feeling came over me. A voice, not from outside, but like a feeling within my body. It told me.
William paused and thought for a moment.
It told me I couldn't kill Jakin without killing myself. I didn't know why I obeyed. The feeling was so overwhelming within me. So I imprisoned him in chains and a barrier. He would be trapped. He'd survive by virtue of his immortality. But in the time it took for the prison to be broken, I thought we could come up with a way to finally deal with him.
Byron moved to ask something else, but his father held up a hand.
I know what you're going to ask me, Byron, but I was a kid, the way you are now. I was unprepared to kill him anyway. And now, after all this time, it seems my task falls to you.
Byron sat back, the revelation hitting him like a punch to the chest. He was somehow going to face the man responsible for slaying his master, driving his father into this aged man he sat beside. It would have been too much for anyone to absorb, let alone a young prince who had never seen the world.
The barrier will soon fall, and when it does, Jakin will come for me.
William's face was more serious now. Byron and Raleigh looked upon him seeking his wisdom.
I never called myself king.
The words were sudden after a long pause, the aged man changing the conversation.
When Cass and I founded this keep, it was a place for refugees to escape the harshness of the wastes left after 200 years of death. I had no idea it might grow, and that I would meet your mother here.
Byron understood why his father was thinking about this, and so he answered the thoughts the very best way he knew how.
It isn't destroyed yet, Father. We will stand and fight.
William groaned as he pushed up from his throne.
No! You must set out from here and follow the puppeteer's army back to Jakin.
Byron also stood, but didn't acknowledge his father's words. William noticed the sudden flash of resolve as his son picked up his sword and sheath and fastened them to his waist. William, rather than voice his displeasure at his son's lack of attention, asked him a question as the boy pulled the sword and resheathed it.
What are you going to do?
The words were a little more kind than he'd intended them to sound.
I'm going to find my brother. It's time he takes his role in this.
Byron turned to go down the entrance hall to fetch his hooded cloak and leather cuirass, his resolve stronger by the step. Varric, who stood in silence during the exchange, followed after the prince in the same silence. Many miles away, a man and woman stood side by side on a thick oak branch of a tree overlooking a small village. The woman looked at the man, her pure white eyes an instant reminder to anyone that she was blind.
Shouldn't we be tailing that army? Or at least going back to Stonehaven Keep to meet Byron?
She was annoyed and confused as to why they were stationary here. Benjamin looked at her with a stone expression he knew she could not read.
No, he's coming to me.